welcome to our deep dive into Dataism.
Deism.
It's a fascinating concept, you know.
Yeah.
It might sound a little bit like science fiction at first, but when you really get down to it, the ideas behind Dataism have been around for quite a while now.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, Dataism views the universe as this massive network of data flows, and it judges everything based on how it contributes to processing all that data.
And what's really intriguing is that it's not just limited to the digital world, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Dataism sees those data flows everywhere, from like our own biology to the complex systems of society.
Right.
And even the economy.
Exactly. It's like looking at the world through a new lens where everything, you know, from our emotions to the stock market, can be understood as part of this grand data processing system.
It's a whole new perspective.
For those who might not be familiar with Dataism, let's break it down a bit further. Where did this idea even come from?
Well, Dataism really emerged from advancements in two key areas: biology and computer science.
Okay.
So since Darwin, biologists have increasingly been viewing organisms as these intricate biochemical algorithms, essentially complex systems that process information and respond to their environment.
So even something as simple as a single-celled organism is processing data in a way.
Precisely.
Wow.
And on the flip side, computer science, since Turing, has been focused on developing more and more sophisticated electronic algorithms, the very building blocks of our digital world.
So we have biology looking at life as these biological algorithms. We have computer science creating these electronic algorithms.
Yes.
And Dataism comes in and says, hey, there's a connection between these two.
That's right.
Seemingly disparate fields.
Yeah, Dataism proposes that both biochemical and electronic algorithms, despite their differences, operate on the same fundamental mathematical principles.
Okay.
In essence, there's a hidden code, a set of underlying laws governing data processing. That runs through everything, from a single cell to a complex computer program.
That's a pretty radical concept.
It is.
So Dataism is blurring the lines between the living and the digital, suggesting that we're not all that different from our smartphones.
At least from a data processing perspective.
At least from a data processing perspective, exactly.
Right.
And this blurring of lines has a certain appeal.
Yes.
Particularly for those who are seeking a unifying theory, a way to connect the dots across different disciplines.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be intriguing, this idea that there's this common thread running through everything.
Yeah.
But if everything is just data,
right,
what happens to things like human knowledge and wisdom?
That's a great question.
Where do those fit into this data-driven worldview?
Yeah. See, traditionally, we view learning as this sort of pyramid, right?
Okay.
You start with raw data, then you process it into information. You build upon that to form knowledge, and ultimately, through experience and reflection, you arrive at wisdom.
Right, that makes sense. It's like climbing a ladder of understanding.
Exactly.
From basic data to profound insights.
But Dataism throws a bit of a wrench into that model.
Okay.
Dataists argue that with the sheer volume of data that's exploding all around us, we humans are simply unable to keep up.
Yeah, I can see that.
You know, we're drowning in information.
It's coming from everywhere.
Our ability to process it into meaningful knowledge and wisdom is becoming more and more overwhelmed.
So it's like we're stuck at the bottom of that pyramid, buried under an avalanche of data.
That's the concern,
Wow.
Dataists believe that electronic algorithms, with their immense processing power and speed, are far better equipped to handle this data deluge. They can analyze vast amounts of information, identify patterns, and extract insights that we humans might miss entirely.
So instead of trying to climb that pyramid ourselves, Dataism suggests we should just hand the ladder over to the algorithms and let them do the climbing for us.
In a way, yes.
Wow.
Dataism sees big data and powerful algorithms as the keys to unlocking a deeper understanding of the universe.
Okay.
Even more so than human intuition or experience.
That's a pretty radical shift in how we think about learning and knowledge.
It is.
But if Dataism is really taking hold, where are we seeing its influence in the real world?
Well, Dataism's influence is most apparent in computer science, of course.
Sure.
But it's also having a profound impact on biology.
Biology?
Yeah, revolutionizing how we view life itself.
I wouldn't have guessed that. How so?
Well, Dataism has led to a shift in how we understand living organisms.
Okay.
From the simplest bacteria to complex animals like ourselves.
Right.
We're now seen as data processing systems, constantly taking in information, making decisions, and responding to our environment based on that data.
So it's not just about understanding our biology on a cellular level.
Right.
It's about seeing ourselves as these interconnected networks of data flow.
Precisely. And it goes even further than that. Dataism applies this lens not only to individual organisms, but to larger systems as well.
Okay.
Societies like beehives, ant colonies, even bustling cities, all seen through this data-driven lens, each a complex network of information exchange and processing.
So it's about understanding how individual actors, whether they're cells or people, interact and function as part of these larger data-driven systems.
Exactly.
And dataism takes this concept a step further, suggesting that even incredibly complex systems like the economy can be viewed as a form of data processing. The economy.
Yeah.
That's a big leap. Yeah, I usually think about the economy in terms of, jobs, businesses buying and selling.
Right.
What does data processing have to do with any of that?
It's about shifting our perspective.
Okay.
Instead of just focusing on the tangible goods and services that we produce and consume, dataism encourages us to see the economy as a system for gathering, processing, and acting on information.
So it's not just about the stuff itself.
Yeah.
It's about the information that guides the production, distribution, and consumption of that stuff.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because dataism suggests that even seemingly opposed economic systems like capitalism and communism can be seen as competing models of data processing.
Capitalism versus communism as a data processing competition.
Yeah.
That's a new way to look at it.
It might sound unusual, but that's the lens dataism offers.
Yeah.
It sees capitalism as a system of distributed data processing, where information flows freely between individuals and companies, leading to independent decision-making.
Okay.
On the other hand, it views communism as a more centralized model, where information is often channeled through a central authority, leading to a more top-down approach to data processing and decision-making.
So it's like two different operating systems for the economy, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly.
And dataism suggests that these different approaches to data processing have profound implications for how these systems function, and which ultimately proves more effective in navigating an increasingly complex and data-driven world.
Exactly.
This has already given me a lot to think about.
It is a big topic.
To really grasp this, I think we need to explore how these competing systems of capitalism and communism actually process data in practice.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's where we'll pick up in part 2.
Okay.
Taking a closer look at how capitalism's distributed data processing works.
Right.
And then contrasting that with communism's more centralized approach.
Sounds good.
I'm eager to learn more. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our Dataism deep dive.
Great. All right, so let's dive into how capitalism actually processes data in this distributed way.
When I think about capitalism, I usually think about companies and competition.
Right.
Not necessarily data processing.
Right.
How does dataism connect those ideas?
Well, it's all about information flow. At its core, capitalism thrives on this constant exchange of information between producers and consumers.
Okay.
They're interacting freely, making independent decisions,
Right.
and driving the flow of goods and services based on the data they have.
Okay. I'm starting to see the connection. But can you give me a concrete example of how this distributed data processing plays out in a capitalist system?
Sure. Let's take the simple example of bread pricing.
Okay.
In a free market, bakeries can bake as much bread as they want and set their own prices. Consumers can then choose to buy bread from whichever bakery offers the best price and quality.
So it's like a constant negotiation.
Exactly.
With both producers and consumers responding to data signals like prices and availability.
Exactly. The price of bread isn't set by some central authority.
Right.
It emerges organically from the interactions of all those individual players in the market.
But it's not just about bakers and consumers, right?
No.
There's so many other factors that can influence the price of bread.
Absolutely. Think about the cost of ingredients like flour,
Right.
the availability of labor, even things like weather patterns affecting wheat harvests.
Sure.
All of these factors feed into the price, reflecting a vast network of information that's constantly being processed and acted upon.
It sounds like a remarkably complex system with all this data flowing in from multiple sources and influencing decisions in real time.
It is complex.
Wow.
But that's the beauty of distributed processing.
Okay.
It can take into account such a wide range of data points,
Right.
constantly adjusting and adapting to changes in the market.
So it's not just about setting prices.
No.
This flow of information also influences how producers respond to consumer demand, right?
Precisely. Imagine investors predicting a future increase in bread demand.
Okay.
They might choose to invest in biotech companies developing higher yield wheat varieties or more efficient picking technologies.
So the flow of information not only shapes what we buy,
Right.
but also drives innovation and technological development.
Exactly. And if one company's approach fails,
others are free to try different solutions. It's a dynamic system of competition and adaptation fueled by this constant exchange of information.
This is starting to paint a very different picture of capitalism than I'm used to. It's not just about profits and competition.
Right.
It's about this intricate dance of data driving innovation and responsiveness.
That's Dedi's perspective.
Wow.
It sees capitalism as a system that's remarkably adept at processing information and adapting to change. And a prime example of this distributed data processing in action is the stock exchange.
Ah, the stock market, the heart of the capitalist system.
But think about it from a data perspective.
Right.
The stock exchange is essentially a massive interconnected network where information from around the globe is constantly being processed and reflected in the prices of stocks and other financial instruments.
So it's not just about companies buying and selling shares.
Right.
It's about processing information about global events, economic trends, individual company performance.
Yes, all of that.
All of that.
All of that and more.
Wow.
It's processing news headlines, political developments, even rumors and speculation.
Yeah.
All at incredible speed. Some estimates suggest the stock exchange can incorporate new information and adjust prices within minutes.
That's mind-blowing. It's like a giant collective brain constantly analyzing data and making decisions based on the latest information.
It's an impressive system.
It really is. And this is where the capitalist preference for lower taxes comes in.
Yeah.
They believe that heavy taxation can disrupt this efficient system of distributed data processing.
That's right.
How so? I'm not sure I follow.
Well, when a large portion of capital ends up concentrated in the hands of the government, it can create a bottleneck in the flow of information. More decisions have to be made by that central authority, which can slow down the system's ability to adapt and respond to change.
So from a data's perspective, capitalists see lower taxes as a way to keep that information flowing freely.
Yes.
And ensure that processing power remains distributed throughout the system. Precisely. They believe that when individuals and companies are free to make their own decisions, based on the information they have access to, the system as a whole functions more efficiently and adapts more readily to new challenges.
Okay, that's the capitalist side of the story.
Right.
But what about communism? How does Dataism view its more centralized approach to data processing?
Well, the ideal of communism, at least in theory, is to create a society where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their needs.
That sounds like a noble goal. But how does that translate into a system of data processing?
In a communist system, information about people's abilities and needs would ideally flow upwards to a central planning authority, like the government. This authority would then analyze that data and make decisions about how resources should be allocated, what goods and services should be produced, and how they should be distributed.
So it's like a giant data collection and decision-making hub with the government acting as the central processor.
Exactly. And in its purest form, this model eliminates the need for markets or prices. Because the central authority is theoretically making the most efficient and equitable decisions based on all the data it has collected.
But wait a minute. Didn't the Soviet Union, which was a communist state, still have prices and markets? How does that fit into this model of centralized data processing?
That's a great question. And it highlights the challenges of putting this idealized model of centralized data processing into practice. The Soviet Union, while aspiring to this central planning ideal, still had to rely on some market mechanisms to deal with the complexities of a vast and diverse economy.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, trying to force a system that, at least according to Dataism, isn't really designed to handle that much data in such a centralized way.
That's one way to look at it. And Dataism would argue that this inherent mismatch between the centralized model and the realities of a complex economy contributed to some of the inefficiencies and failures of the Soviet system.
Can you give me a specific example of how this centralized data processing played out in the Soviet Union and maybe where it went wrong?
Sure. Let's look at the story of Trofim Lysenko. a Soviet biologist who rose to prominence in the 1930s. Lysenko rejected mainstream genetics, particularly the idea of genes as the primary units of heredity.
Right.
Instead, he promoted his own theories, which were more aligned with Marxist ideology.
Interesting.
Emphasizing the influence of environmental factors over inherited traits.
So his scientific theories were influenced by political ideology?
Yes. And because the Soviet system centralized scientific decision-making, Lysenko's theories, despite being scientifically flawed, were embraced by the government.
Wow.
And enforced across Soviet agriculture.
So instead of relying on a diversity of scientific viewpoints and letting the data speak for itself, the central authority essentially chose a winner based on political expediency.
That's one interpretation. And the consequences were significant. Lysenko's agricultural practices based on his flawed theories led to widespread crop failures. And contributed to food shortages in the Soviet Union.
Wow, that's a stark example of how centralized data processing can go wrong, especially when ideology trumps scientific evidence.
It is a cautionary tale.
It is.
Yeah.
But if Dataism sees capitalism as a more efficient data processing system, does that mean it's inherently superior to communism?
It's important to remember that Dataism doesn't make value judgments like superior or inferior. It simply analyzes systems based on how they process information. However, some proponents of Dataism do point to the outcome of the Cold War as evidence that distributed data processing might be more adaptable and resilient. Especially in a rapidly changing technological landscape.
So the Soviet Union, with its centralized system, struggled to keep up with the pace of innovation driven by capitalism's more distributed approach.
That's the argument some make.
Yeah, it's like a large, slow-moving ship trying to compete with a fleet of speedboats.
That's a good analogy. Think about it. The Soviet Union, while capable of producing some impressive feats of engineering, struggled to foster the kind of dynamic innovation that led to the rise of companies like Apple, platforms like Wikipedia, and this whole explosion of consumer technologies that we see in capitalist societies.
So Dataism suggests that capitalism might have a data processing edge when it comes to innovation.
Perhaps.
But what about its ability to meet the needs of the people? Didn't the Soviet Union, at least in theory, prioritize providing for everyone's basic needs?
That was the ideal, yes. But the challenges of centralized data processing often hindered those efforts in practice. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that illustrates this point quite well.
Ooh, a story. I always love a good anecdote. Tell me more.
It involves a Soviet official visiting London
to try to understand how the capitalist system worked. So this official is being shown around London, visiting the stock exchange meeting with economists. And throughout the day, he's struck by one thing: the lack of bread queues.
Bread queues?
Yes. In the Soviet Union, long lines for bread were a common sight. A symptom of the inefficiencies and shortages that often plagued the centrally planned economy.
So the Soviet official is baffled by the abundance of bread in London and the absence of these long lines.
Exactly. He's so perplexed that he asks his hosts to take him to meet the person in charge of London's bread supply. Eager to learn their secret.
I'm on the edge of my seat. What happens next?
His hosts, after a moment of confusion, tell him, nobody's in charge of supplying bread to London.
Wait, what? No one's in charge? How does that even work?
That, according to the story, is the essence of the capitalist system. No single entity controls the flow of information or makes all the decisions.
Instead, it's an emergent self-organizing system, driven by the decentralized actions of millions of individuals and companies.
So back to the bread example. It's not some central planner deciding how much bread to bake and where to send it. It's bakers responding to local demand consumers, making choices based on price and quality. And this constant flow of information dictating how resources are allocated.
Precisely. And while this system is not perfect, and certainly has its own challenges, Dataism suggests that its distributed nature makes it more adaptable, resilient, and innovative, especially in a world awash in data and driven by technological change.
This has been incredibly insightful, thinking about everything from our own bodies to entire economies as these data processing systems is really shifting my perspective. But I have to admit, it's a bit overwhelming too.
It's a radical shift in perspective, no doubt. And it raises a lot of profound questions about the future.
It does.
If Dataism continues to gain traction, what does it mean for human agency and decision-making?
Yeah, if we're all just data points in a vast system,
Right.
are we really in control of our own destinies? Or are we just along for the ride?
That's the million-dollar question. And we'll explore those implications, along with some of the potential downsides of this data-driven worldview, when we return for the final part of our Datism deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dives into Datism. We've covered a lot of ground from the origins of this idea to how it views both biology and economics through this lens of data processing.
It's definitely been a thought-provoking journey.
It really has. And, honestly, it's left me with a lot of questions.
Yeah.
If everything boils down to data processing, as Datism suggests, where do we humans fit in?
Right.
Do we have any real agency in a world that seems to be increasingly dominated by algorithms?
That's a big question, and it's a concern that a lot of people share. If algorithms become so good at processing data and making decisions, what role is there left for human intuition, creativity, and free will?
Yes, exactly. Are we heading towards a future where algorithms are dictating everything, from what we eat to who we marry, while we just passively go along for the ride?
It's a dystopian vision that science fiction has explored for decades, right?
It really has.
This idea of machines taking over and humans becoming irrelevant.
Yeah.
But dataism doesn't necessarily have to lead to that outcome.
So there's hope for us humans yet?
I think so.
Okay, good. Tell me more.
Well, remember, datism at its core is really just a way of understanding the world.
Okay.
It's a lens through which we can view these complex systems and processes. It doesn't inherently dictate a specific set of values or prescribe, a particular course of action.
So it's a tool, not a blueprint.
Yeah.
A way of seeing, not a set of instructions.
That's one way to think about it. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill. It all depends on how we choose to wield it.
So the future isn't predetermined. We still have a say in how things play out, even in this increasingly data-driven world.
Absolutely. Human choices, values, and aspirations still matter deeply. Dataism simply provides us with a new framework for understanding the forces at play, the information flows that shape our lives.
So it's not about humans versus machines.
Right.
It's about finding ways to harness the power of data while retaining our autonomy and our humanity.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that data is a powerful force, but it's not the only force. Human ingenuity, empathy, our capacity for moral reasoning.
Right.
All of these still have vital roles to play.
That's a much more optimistic outlook.
Well, I think so.
But even if we can find a way to coexist with these increasingly powerful algorithms, isn't there a risk that datism itself becomes a kind of ideology?
Yeah.
A belief system that dictates how we see the world and make decisions.
That's a valid concern. Anytime a new idea gains traction, there's always a risk that it becomes dogma.
Right.
A set of rigid beliefs that stifle critical thinking and dissent.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we embrace the insights of dataism without letting it become the only lens through which we view the world?
Well, I think the key, as with any powerful idea, is to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right.
Question its assumptions, consider alternative perspectives.
So it's not about blindly accepting everything dataism says.
Right.
It's about engaging with it, critically challenging its claims and seeing where it leads us.
Exactly. Dataism can be a valuable tool for understanding the world, but it shouldn't be the only tool in our toolbox. We need to retain our capacity for independent thought, moral reasoning.
Right.
And for recognizing that not everything can be reduced to data points and algorithms.
Well said. I think that's a great point to wrap up on. Dataism is a fascinating and complex idea, one that's likely to have a profound impact on our lives in the years to come. But as we've explored in this deep dive, it's not a deterministic force. We still have choices to make, decisions to wrestle with, and a responsibility to shape the future we want to see.
Absolutely. And that future, while undoubtedly shaped by data, will ultimately be determined by the values we choose to uphold, the stories we tell ourselves, and the connections we forge with each other.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into datism. We hope it's given you a new perspective on the world and left you with plenty to ponder as you navigate this increasingly data-driven world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those data flows moving.